Clara had always believed that love, once found, was something unbreakable. She built her days on the quiet certainty of that truth, layering her future with plans, dreams, and promises she thought would endure forever. For 5 years she had poured herself into a relationship that had once glowed with passion and warmth, a bond that had felt so unshakable that she rarely imagined life without it. And then, with the suddenness of a storm that tears through an unsuspecting town, it was gone. The end came not with a fight or a grand betrayal, but with the hollow weight of indifference. He, Daniel, the man she had once sworn was her other half, sat across from her in their kitchen one late autumn evening, his voice steady, almost gentle. He said he was tired. Tired of the life they had built, tired of the sameness, tired of her. The words, though calmly spoken, struck Clara like a fall from a great height. There was no warning, no cushion, just the jarring impact of being told that all she had given was no longer wanted. She felt herself unravel in that moment, though outwardly she barely moved. Her chest burned with a sharp ache, as though the titingo din maug jest, persist burned with a sharp ache. Breath had been stolen from her lungs. The walls of their home, once filled with laughter and shared plans, suddenly seemed foreign and cold. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she watched as Daniel pushed his chair back, stood, and walked out of the kitchen, out of their life together, without looking back. For days after, Clara wandered through their apartment in a haze, her grief shapeless and consuming. The life they had woven together had been undone in an instant, leaving behind threads that tangled around her heart. Every object, the coffee mug he always reached for, the jacket he left hanging on the back of a chair, the photographs taped to the fridge, became a cruel reminder of the emptiness that now filled her days. Nights were the worst. She would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her body aching with the absence of his familiar weight beside her. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was fractured, haunted by dreams that brought him back only to rip him away again. Her friends offered comfort, each in their own way. Some urged her to move on, while others sat quietly, offering her their presence without words. Yet none of it reached the raw center of her pain. The ache after the fall was something no one else could touch. It was private, invisible, and relentless. Even when she smiled or nodded, even when she told them she was healing, inside she carried the sharp reminder of what she had lost. Clara began to realize that she needed distance, not just from Daniel, not just from the city that seemed to echo with memories of him, but from everything that tied her to the life that had crumbled. The walls of the apartment closed in on her, suffocating with their silence, and the streets she walked every day felt haunted by shadows of their shared routines. She longed for escape, for a place where the ache could stretch out and soften, where she might breathe without feeling the constant sting of heartbreak. That's when she remembered the cabin. It had been a dream once, a plan they had sketched together during one of their brighter seasons. A rustic Apache cabin in the mountains, surrounded by endless trees and the hush of nature. They had imagined weekends there, curled by the fireplace, mornings with coffee on the porch, and summers watching the stars carve their way across a velvet sky. Daniel had called it their someday place. But someday never came. Now Clara realized the cabin was hers alone. The deed had always been in her name, a gift from her grandmother passed down before she died. At the time, Clara had thought of it as something she and Daniel would cherish together. But now, in the aftermath of the fall, the cabin became something different, not a shared dream, but a lifeline. As she packed a bag and prepared to leave the city behind, she felt the ache of her broken heart press against her chest again, sharp and insistent. Yet beneath the ache, there was a flicker of something else, not hope, not yet, but the faintest sense of possibility. Perhaps, Away from the ruins of her old life, she could begin to face the ache. Perhaps in the silence of the mountains, she might learn how to breathe again. The drive to the mountains stretched before Clara like a pilgrimage she hadn't realized she was preparing for. She packed lightly, a suitcase with enough clothes. For a month, a few books, her journal, and a box of tea she couldn't live without. She left behind most of the life she had shared with Daniel, the framed photographs, the throw blankets he had chosen, the little mementos of trips taken together. She couldn't bear to bring those echoes into her retreat. This journey, she told herself, was about carving space for her own breath, her own healing. The further she drove from the city, the lighter the air seemed to feel. Highways gave way to narrow winding roads, and glass towers were replaced by towering pines that reached toward the sky like watchful guardians. With every mile, Clara could sense a thin layer of her grief peeling away, though the ache at her core remained. Stubborn and deep. The Apache cabin appeared at the end of a dirt path, half hidden among the trees. Its wooden beams were weathered by years of sun and snow, and the porch sagged slightly, as though the house itself carried its own history of burdens. Yet to Clara, it looked like sanctuary. She parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence for a long moment. The only sounds were the sighing of wind through the branches and the distant call of a hawk. It felt as if the world had quieted just for her arrival. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and thyme. Dust motes danced in the light slanting through the windows, and the floor creaked with each step. The furniture was simple but sturdy. A small table, 2 wooden chairs, a sofa by the fireplace, and a narrow bed in the corner room. Her grandmother had kept the space modest, functional, untouched by the clutter of modern life. Clara ran her fingers across the windowsill, feeling the cool grain of the wood beneath her hand. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in the stillness, reminding her that this place had always been meant for rest, for finding oneself again. The first night was the hardest. She built a fire with shaky hands, the warmth battling against the chill that crept in from the mountain air. Sitting before the flames, she let herself cry openly, without fear of being overheard. Tears streaked down her cheeks, hot against the cool air, but no relief followed. Instead, the ache only deepened, expanding inside her chest until it seemed the cabin itself was breathing her sorrow with her. When exhaustion finally pulled her to bed, she fell asleep with the fire still flickering, her body curled tight as if protecting herself from unseen blows. Morning brought a tentative sense of renewal. The forest outside was alive with sound. Birds calling, leaves rustling, branches shifting against the wind. Clara brewed tea in the small kitchen, the steam rising like a fragile promise. She took her mug out to the porch and sat, watching as the sun broke through the trees. For the first time in weeks, she felt a moment of stillness that wasn't filled with Daniel's shadow. It was small, fleeting, but it was hers. Her days quickly fell into a rhythm. Mornings on the porch with tea. Afternoons spent walking the trails that twisted through the woods. Evenings with her journal, where she poured out her heart in jagged lines that sometimes turned into poetry, sometimes into letters she would never send. The cabin became both mirror and refuge, reflecting her loneliness while sheltering her from the world's noise. Yet the silence was not always kind. At night, when the forest grew too quiet, Clara's mind replayed the fall again and again. She could still see Daniel's face in the kitchen, hear the calm finality of his voice. She would press her hands against her chest, as though she could hold the ache in place, keep it from spreading too far. Some nights she thought of leaving, packing her bag, driving back to the city, surrendering to the familiar chaos of life that might drown out her pain. But each time she stayed. Something in her knew that running from this solitude would mean running from herself. One evening, as the fire cracked and the cabin hummed with silence, Clara whispered aloud, I don't know how to be without him." Her own voice startled her, thin, trembling, breaking the quiet in a way that felt both dangerous and necessary. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words had forced their way out, like a truth too heavy to keep inside. The sound of her whisper lingered in the room, echoing faintly against the walls. For the first time, she wondered if the silence was truly empty at all. And though she didn't know it yet, that single whispered confession was the beginning of something, the first thread of connection that would soon change everything. The days at the cabin stretched in a quiet rhythm, each one blending into the next, marked only by the shifting light through the trees and the slow rise and fall of Clara's own heartbeat. She moved through her new world like a shadow of herself, careful not to disturb the delicate balance she was beginning to feel. Every creak of the wooden floor, every whisper of wind through the pines, seemed amplified in the emptiness. The silence pressed against her, heavy and unrelenting, yet in its own strange way, it was comforting. There was no one to judge her. Grief, no one to demand she perform happiness or smile when it hurt. Clara discovered the strange intimacy of isolation. The walls of the cabin held her close, absorbing her whispered thoughts, the soft sounds of her breathing, the occasional sob that racked her chest late at night. In the absence of other voices, her own became startlingly clear. She began to notice little things, the way her own footsteps echoed differently on the worn floorboards, the subtle changes in light as clouds passed over the sun, the scent of pine carried in by a sudden gust of wind. Each observation was a reminder that she was alive, that even in the shadow of heartbreak, life continued its quiet insistence. Yet the silence was also a mirror, reflecting back the ache she had brought with her. Without the noise of the city or the distraction of other people, her grief became a companion she could not ignore. She would sit on the porch in the early morning, steaming mug in hand, and watch the mist curl through the valley below, feeling the weight of the loss press against her ribs. Some days the ache was sharp, a sudden pang that stole her breath. Other days it was slow, a dull, persistent presence that made her movements deliberate and careful. She tried to fill the quiet with rituals. Mornings were for tea and journaling, afternoons for walks through the forest, evenings for reading or tending the small fireplace. Each activity was an attempt to stitch together a sense of normalcy, to create order in a life that had been upended. Yet, no matter what she did, there was always a moment when the silence returned, heavy and unyielding, and she was left with nothing but herself. Clara began to notice how the silence affected her perception of time. Hours stretched, elastic, and unmeasured, as if the world had slowed to match her introspection. Without the usual clamor of human life, honking cars, ringing phones, conversations carried in passing, she became acutely aware of the subtler sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird of prey, the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight. These sounds, faint and irregular, reminded her that she was not entirely alone in the world, even if human companionship was absent. Nights were the most challenging. The forest surrounding the cabin was alive with its own rhythms, the hum of nocturnal insects, the soft scurry of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote or wolf. Alone in her bed, Clara often felt the presence of the cabin more strongly than ever, as if the house itself listened to her breathing, her whispered confessions, her quiet sobs. Sleep came fitfully, and she would wake with the ache of longing pressed against her chest, a constant reminder of the fall she could not undo. In this silence, Clara began to confront parts of herself she had long avoided. Without the distractions of the city or the presence of Daniel, she could no longer mask the emptiness with routines or social interactions. She reflected on the way she had lost herself in the relationship, the compromises, the unspoken resentments, the quiet surrender of her own desires. She began to understand the depth of her grief not just as loss of a person, but as loss of the self she had believed she was. And yet, amidst this reflection, there was a subtle transformation. The silence, though heavy, also offered space for thought, for observation, for small awakenings. She started to notice resilience in herself, the flickers of courage that had carried her to the cabin and kept her there despite the ache. She began to experiment with small joys, lingering over a cup of tea, sketching a leaf that caught her eye, marveling at the sun striking the trees at dawn. The silence was both crucible and sanctuary, a place where her grief could be acknowledged fully, without judgment or interruption, and where the first fragile seeds of healing could quietly take root. It was in this stillness, in the absence of the world she once knew, that Clara began to sense the faintest stirrings of possibility. Something, she did not yet understand what, was waiting in the quiet for her, a presence beyond the ache, a whisper of life that might one day turn her solitude into something more. The nights in the cabin were long and still, filled with a quiet that both comforted and unnerved Clara. She had grown accustomed to the routine, fire crackling, journal open, tea cooling beside her, and the endless forest pressing in from all sides. And yet, one night, as she sat curled on the sofa, something different happened. A sound faint, delicate, and almost imperceptible drifted through the air. At first, she thought it was the wind. The mountains had their own language, whistles, sighs, the brushing of leaves against one another. But this was different. It had a rhythm, a cadence that suggested intention rather than nature. It was soft, a nearly inaudible murmur that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of hearing. Clara froze, listening. Her pulse quickened, the ache in her chest momentarily overshadowed by curiosity. "Hello?" she whispered, unsure if she was truly addressing anyone or merely breaking the oppressive quiet of the cabin with her own voice. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only the subtle hum of the night, the forest, the fire, and her own heartbeat. Then, just as she was about to shake her head and dismiss it, the sound returned, slightly stronger, almost like a reply. It was a voice, not loud, not clear, but unmistakably human. Gentle, warm, and tinged with a quiet sadness, the voice seemed to drift from somewhere nearby, yet intangible. Clara's first instinct was fear. Who could be out here in the mountains at night, whispering through the trees, or perhaps through the walls themselves? But fear quickly gave way to fascination. The voice was soft enough to make her lean forward, straining to catch a word, a fragment of sound that might anchor her to reality. She listened for hours, long past midnight, until the murmurs faded into the distance, leaving her alone again with the fire's glow and the ache in her chest. Sleep came slowly, each creak of the cabin and rustle of the forest keeping her alert. Yet a small ember of curiosity glowed within her. Whoever, or whatever, had spoken. It had stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of presence, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. The next night, the voice returned. This time, Clara allowed herself to speak. "First, I hear you," she said quietly, almost afraid to disturb the fragile connection. The voice hesitated, and then, unmistakably, a whisper answered, "I thought I was alone here." Clara's heart thumped in her chest. It was another soul, someone else dwelling in this vast, silent mountain, someone who also carried the weight of isolation. She could feel the ache of her own loneliness mirrored in this mysterious voice, and for the first time, she sensed a fragile bridge forming between herself and another human being. Days followed in a strange rhythm. By morning, the whisper vanished, leaving only the forest and the cabin. By night, it returned, and they began a tentative exchange. Clara spoke in fragments, thoughts she had never dared voice, fears she had kept hidden, the raw ache of the heartbreak that had brought her here. And in response, the voice murmured back soft, comforting, full of its own grief and hope, though she could not yet see the person behind it. The whisper became a lifeline. In its presence, her sorrow felt lighter, as though someone was sharing the burden of it with her. She began to feel a strange thrill at the anticipation of nightfall, the hour when voices would meet, even if only in the dark spaces between cabins. The ache that had once seemed insurmountable now had a rhythm, a pulse, a dialogue that made it slightly more bearable. Yet Clara could not ignore a subtle unease. Who was this stranger? How had they come to be so near, and why had neither discovered the other before? And most pressingly, could a connection formed entirely through whispers ever survive in the clarity of day? Still, she leaned closer to the walls that night, her ear pressed to the subtle vibrations of the voice. She whispered back, her words trembling but certain, "I don't know your name. I don't know your story, but I'm listening." For the first time since the fall, Clara felt the faintest stirrings of hope. In the quiet, in the shared ache, in the soft, persistent whisper, she realized that the cabin, once a sanctuary from pain, might soon become the beginning of something entirely new. Clara had spent nights speaking to a voice that existed somewhere beyond the walls of her cabin, a presence she could sense but not see. Each evening, the whispers returned like clockwork, drawing her out of the heaviness that had settled in her chest. Yet by day, the forest remained empty, the cabin silent, and the identity of the voice a mystery she couldn't solve. That uncertainty had become both tantalizing and frustrating. She longed to know who it was, to see the person who had quietly seeped into the corners of her life, offering solace when she had thought none could come. It was a gray, mist-draped morning when she finally caught a hint. Clara had decided to venture farther than her usual trail, letting the mountain paths guide her deeper into the trees. She followed the winding creek, the water tumbling over stones with a constant murmur, when she noticed something unusual. Footprints pressed into the damp earth. Small, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Her heart leapt. Could it be him, the voice she had come to recognize, the presence she had felt through the night? She followed the tracks with a mixture of caution and hope, winding through dense pine groves and over moss-covered rocks, until they led her to another cabin, modest and partially hidden behind the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, and in the doorway stood a figure, tall and lean, silhouetted against the muted light of morning. For a moment, Clara's breath caught. There he was, the stranger, the voice now undeniably real. He turned, and their eyes met. Dark, deep-set eyes that carried a softness she hadn't expected, framed by a face both weathered and gentle. There was a pause, a silent acknowledgement that both of them had been wandering through the same ache, unaware that the other existed beyond the whispers. "Clara?" His voice, familiar and intimate even across the distance, trembled with uncertainty. "Yes," she whispered back, her own voice barely carrying over the distance. She realized then that the whispers had been his way of testing the world, of finding connection without the vulnerability of a full meeting. "It's me." He stepped forward, hesitant, as if breaking the boundary between them required courage equal to hers. "I'm Elias," he said finally, offering a hand that was both nervous and steady. Clara felt a jolt, the first real pulse of warmth in weeks. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip and the subtle tremor of shared fear. And hoped they spent the morning talking, cautiously at first, revealing fragments of themselves they had only dared whisper to each other. Elias had been retreating from the world for reasons Clara could already understand. A loss, a solitude that had driven him to the mountains in search of quiet. He spoke of nights spent listening to the forest, wondering if anyone else was there. While Clara admitted her own heartbreak, the fall that had brought her here, and the ache that had followed relentlessly, What amazed Clara was the familiarity, the sense of intimacy they had cultivated through whispers alone. Every nuance of his voice, every careful pause, every subtle inflection had been etched into her memory over weeks of nighttime conversation. The mystery that had once drawn her in became a comfort she could now see, a presence that was tangible and real. By afternoon, the rain began to fall lightly, drumming on the cabin roof and blurring the forest into a silver haze. They moved inside, sitting by the fireplace, the warmth wrapping around them as the storm outside continued. They shared stories, memories, fears, and even laughter, tentative at first, then gradually more relaxed, as if the bond formed in the silence of the nights had translated perfectly into the light of day. For the first time since the fall, Clara felt an ache not of loss, but of anticipation, of possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. She realized that the cabin, once a place to hide from the world and from pain, had become a meeting place of souls, a quiet sanctuary where healing was possible, and in Elias she saw that healing reflected back. He was the stranger who had found her voice in the night, the one who had whispered to her when no one else could reach through the ache. And now finally he was here. The air between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. Neither needed to rush, to define, to explain. The bond had already been forged in whispers, and now it existed in the calm acknowledgement of each other's presence, real, immediate, and full of quiet possibility. As the storm raged outside, Clara realized that her solitude had not been wasted. It had prepared her for this moment, this encounter, this stranger who was no longer merely a voice but a companion, a confidant, and perhaps, in time, something far more. The morning after their first face-to-face encounter, Clara awoke to a quiet stillness that felt different from before. The forest beyond the cabin windows was alive with birdsong, sunlight threading through the branches in delicate patterns. But it wasn't just the day that felt changed, it was the cabin itself. The air seemed warmer, the silence less oppressive. In the corner of her mind, she knew it was because Elias had stayed the night. He hadn't needed to speak much, hadn't needed to fill the space with words. His presence alone reshaped the cabin, reshaped her world. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, one that was unfamiliar yet profoundly comforting. Breakfast was simple: coffee, eggs, and bread warmed by the fire. They sat across from each other at the wooden table, speaking in soft tones, their conversation punctuated by moments of silence that felt more intimate than any words could convey. Clara found herself observing the way Elias's fingers moved. As he held his mug, the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, and the unintentional brush of his hand as he reached for the sugar. It was in those quiet, unremarkable moments that connection grew. They weren't sharing secrets yet, not fully, but they were sharing space, the rare kind of closeness that exists without expectation or pretense. Clara realized that this presence, this companionship, was soothing a part of her ache she hadn't realized could be soothed. Nights of whispers had been one thing, but the warmth of his physical presence, the way the cabin seemed alive with shared breathing, transformed the abstract comfort into something tangible. By afternoon, the rain returned, gentle and persistent, painting the windows with streaks of silver. Clara and Elias sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, listening to the soft percussion of drops on the wooden roof. Words were few because they didn't need many. The first connection wasn't about confessions or revelations. It was about recognition, about understanding without effort. She realized she could feel his solitude as clearly as her own, and he could feel hers. For the first time since the fall, she wasn't alone with her ache. As the hours passed, conversation slowly began to fill the pauses. They spoke of childhood memories, Elias of forests he'd explored in his youth, Clara of summers spent at her grandmother's cabin, learning the patterns of the land and the language of quiet. They laughed softly at small embarrassments, and for the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to enjoy the sound of her own laughter mingling with his. It was strange, she realized, how quickly familiarity could grow from whispers, how trust could emerge even before faces were fully revealed. Before fears were openly named, the connection deepened when Elias shared something small yet intimate. A notebook filled with sketches of the forest around the cabin, little observations he had made during his solitary walks. Clara leafed through it with care, marveling at the beauty captured in such quiet strokes: birds perched on branches, streams winding like silver ribbons, the play of light through leaves. Each page felt like a gift, a piece of him offered. Without pressure, without demand, just shared quietly in the intimacy of understanding. That evening they built a fire together. The logs cracked and hissed, flames flickering and casting their shadows on the walls. Clara felt the ache that had brought her here soften, replaced with a gentle warmth that spread through her chest. She realized it was no longer just about healing from loss. It was about discovering the possibility of something new, something rooted in connection, patience, and quiet understanding. And in Elias, she found a reflection of herself, a companion shaped by grief, yet open to possibility, cautious yet willing to reach toward something unknown. The first connection, she realized, was not a single moment, but a series of small gestures, shared silences, and subtle recognitions that together formed a bridge between two hearts. As night settled over the mountains, Clara leaned back in her chair, watching the glow of the fire play across Elias's face. For the first time since the fall, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included someone else, not as a replacement for what she had lost, but as a new chapter written in the quiet, patient intimacy of a shared cabin, a shared ache, and the fragile promise of love. The ache Clara had carried for weeks, a constant, low hum in her chest, began to shift in the presence of Elias. It did not disappear. Not entirely, for grief and heartbreak are stubborn companions. But its edges softened as if the steady warmth of his presence had begun to melt the frost around her heart. She noticed it in small, almost imperceptible ways. The weight in her chest lifted slightly when she heard his laugh. The nights felt less lonely, and the forest, once a backdrop to her sorrow, became a landscape alive with possibility. They had fallen into a rhythm of shared existence. Mornings began with coffee, sometimes silent, sometimes filled with murmured reflections on dreams, the trees, or memories long tucked away. Afternoons were spent exploring the trails that twisted through the mountains, watching sunlight dance across leaves, listening to the creek babble over stones. In these moments, Clara felt the ache unravel, loosening its grip as she let herself notice the world anew. Not just the void Daniel had left behind. Elias had a way of noticing her subtle shifts. When she laughed unexpectedly, he would smile softly, and when she fell silent, he offered the quiet space to simply be. His attentiveness was neither intrusive nor demanding. It was patient, gentle, and grounded in a shared understanding. Clara began to recognize the difference between the ache of loss and the ache that comes from longing for connection. One was a weight she had carried alone. The other was a tender pull toward someone who truly saw her, one evening after a day of wandering deeper into the forest. They returned to the cabin as the sun dipped behind the trees, spilling gold across the mountainside. Clara carried firewood in her arms, and Elias followed, hands full of branches and kindling. The simple act of preparing the fire together, stacking wood with quiet cooperation, became a ritual that felt like more than survival. It was an act of intimacy, a shared creation that required trust, timing, and care. As the flames flickered to life, casting shadows on the walls, Clara realized she could feel the ache loosening within her. It was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer defined her entire being. She thought back to the fall that had brought her to this place, the nights of silence, and the whispered voice that had first reached her in the darkness. Every step of that journey had led her here, to this warmth, this shared presence, this gradual unraveling of pain. Elias spoke then, softly, breaking the silence that had grown comfortable but not suffocating. "I never thought I'd find someone else who understands silence the way we do," he said, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Someone who doesn't rush to fill it, but listens to it, lives in it with me." Clara's chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with the recognition of a shared truth. "I used to think silence meant loneliness," she replied. "But with you, it's something else. It's where I can breathe, where I can feel, where the ache softens." They didn't need to define it beyond that. There was no grand proclamation, no dramatic declaration of love. The unraveling of ache was subtler than that, more profound. It existed in shared glances, in the brush of hands while passing firewood, in quiet confessions spoken under the stars. Each small gesture was a thread, weaving a new tapestry over the raw edges of heartbreak. Later that night, Clara sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the soft rain pattering on the roof. Elias slept quietly on the sofa, curled up with a book he had abandoned hours before. For the first time since the fall, she didn't feel the weight of grief pressing down on her. Instead, there was a tentative lightness, a fragile hope that life could still hold joy, laughter, and connection, even after loss. The ache had not disappeared, nor would it completely, for some part of it was woven into who she was. But it had transformed. What had once been a sharp, unyielding pain was now tempered by trust, companionship, and the quiet intimacy of someone who understood without needing to fix. The fall had brought her here, and the whispers had guided her through the darkness. And now, in the presence of Elias, the ache could unravel gently, leaving space for something entirely new to grow. The nights had grown shorter, but the anticipation between Clara and Elias had become more intense. Their connection, built carefully, through whispers and shared silences, had begun to stretch into daylight hours, each look and touch a gentle test of boundaries, of comfort, of trust. And yet, there remained a subtle hesitation, a quiet awareness that intimacy, once fully realized, carried both the thrill of closeness and the vulnerability of exposure. It was on a stormy evening that the crossing began, the first real step from whispered connection to fully shared presence. Rain hammered against the cabin roof, cascading in rivulets down the walls, and the wind shook the pines with a persistent groan. Clara sat on the porch, blanket wrapped tightly around her, staring at the blurred forest. She could hear the creaks, roar intensified by the storm, the distant cracking of branches, and beneath it all, the soft thrum of her own pulse. Elias appeared at the edge of the porch, drenched and hesitant, carrying nothing but the weight of his own uncertainty. The whispering nights had taught them how to speak across walls and through shadows, but now there was no wall, no distance to hide behind, only the raw immediacy of presence. I couldn't stay inside anymore," he said, voice almost lost to the storm. His eyes, dark and searching, met hers, and in that instant, Clara felt the familiar ache stir, not of loss, but of anticipation, of vulnerability, of desire to leap and trust that the other would catch her. She rose from the chair, her bare feet cold against the wet wood, and took a cautious step toward him. "I've been waiting," she admitted, her voice trembling but certain. "Waiting for you to come out here. Waiting for this, for us, to feel real." The space between them was measured in heartbeats, in whispered breaths carried over the rain. And then, slowly, deliberately, Elias stepped closer, closing the gap. The first touch was tentative, fingertips brushing against her hand, a shared warmth that electrified the quiet storm around them. Clara felt her chest expand, her ache dissolving in the heat of human contact. In the recognition that the whispering nights had prepared her for this leap, that every cautious confession, every silent pause, had been a rehearsal for the crossing, they stood together, soaked to the bone, the storm washing over them. And yet the world felt suspended, compressed into a fragile bubble of shared understanding. Elias reached for her, hands trembling slightly, and Clara responded instinctively, leaning into the safety of his presence. The crossing was not dramatic, not filled with words or declarations. It was subtle, a gentle merging of two hearts long accustomed to solitude, a quiet surrender to trust. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire enveloped them as they peeled away damp layers, the scent of rain mingling with cedar smoke. They sat together, close but not yet intertwined, speaking softly of the storm outside, of fleeting moments, of thoughts that had remained unspoken until this point. Every shared glance, every careful smile, was a thread in a tapestry that had been forming in whispers for weeks, now strengthened by the courage to exist fully together. Later, as the rain eased and the night deepened, Clara rested her head against Elias's shoulder. She felt the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, a steady, grounding presence. The ache that had once defined her nights had transformed. It was no longer a void, but a tender reminder of how far she had come. She had crossed the threshold. From isolation to connection, from whispered intimacy to shared presence, and the cabin, once a place of retreat, now held the warmth of companionship, trust, and fragile hope. In the crossing, Clara realized something profound. Love, like the mountains themselves, required patience, courage, and the willingness to face storms. The fall had been painful, the ache relentless, but each step, each whisper, each careful touch had prepared her for this moment. And now, standing together in the aftermath of a storm, she understood that the journey through grief and solitude was not an end but a passage, a crossing into something new, something alive and something real. The night settled over them with quiet certainty. The storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening under the moonlight. And in that luminous stillness, Clara felt a truth she had long denied. Love could begin again, even after loss, even after ache, and sometimes all it took was a crossing. A single step, a shared heartbeat, and the courage to trust that someone else could hold the weight of your world. The cabin had always been a place of refuge, a quiet sanctuary carved from the wilderness, but now it was transforming into something more. With Elias's presence, every creaking floorboard and sunlit corner seemed to vibrate with life. The air no longer carried the sharp tang of solitude. Instead, it was infused with warmth, shared laughter, and the subtle comfort of two people learning to inhabit the same space. Mornings began with routines that had once been solitary but now felt collaborative. Clara brewed coffee while Elias set out plates for breakfast, each movement mindful, synchronized like a silent choreography. There was a gentle ease in this rhythm, no rush, no expectation, only presence. The ache she had carried for so long had softened, replaced by an expanding tenderness that arose from the simple act of coexistence. Afternoons were often spent exploring the forest together, walking trails that curved around the creek, or climbing higher along ridges where the mountains opened into vast, sun-drenched vistas. Clara had once wandered these paths alone, listening to the whisper of the wind and the rush of water, but now each step was accompanied by Elias's voice, his laughter, the occasional brush of his hand against hers. The solitude that had been a crucible for reflection now merged with companionship, creating a new kind of intimacy that neither had anticipated but both had been quietly ready for. Inside the cabin, healing manifested in small, tangible ways. They painted the walls of the kitchen a warmer shade, rearranged the furniture to make space for shared meals, and added soft blankets to the chairs near the fireplace. Each alteration was a statement of belonging, a subtle claim on the cabin as theirs together, rather than a place of retreat from the world. Clara found herself laughing freely, the sound echoing off the walls in a way it hadn't for months. The ache that had followed her from the city now seemed to shrink in the glow of these shared moments. Evenings became a sanctuary in their own right. They would light the fire, curl up with books, or simply sit together in companionable silence, listening to the rain tapping against the roof or the creaking of the old timbers. Clara marveled at how ordinary these moments felt, yet how profoundly they touched her. In these quiet, everyday rituals, she realized that healing was not a single moment but a collection of small, consistent acts of presence and care. The cabin itself seemed to reflect their transformation. Where it had once felt cold and heavy with absence, it now radiated warmth. The sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the smoke curling from the fireplace, the books stacked carefully on shelves. The sketches Elias had made of the surrounding forest hung in frames along the walls. Each element was a marker of life, creativity, and shared space. The cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a witness to their bond, a tangible representation of the healing they were experiencing together. One evening, as the fire glowed low and the night settled over the mountains, Clara found herself resting her head against Elias's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. "I never imagined this," she murmured, voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire, "that a place I came to escape from the world could become this." Elias smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's not just the cabin," he replied. "It's us. The space was here all along, but we filled it with something real: laughter, trust, presence. Healing isn't just what happens inside us alone. It's what we create together." Clara let the truth of his words settle into her bones. She had arrived at the cabin burdened by grief and solitude, carrying an ache she thought would never subside. Yet here, in this shared space, she had discovered something profound: that pain could be softened, even transformed, through connection, compassion, and mutual presence. The cabin had borne witness to her journey from heartbreak to hope, from silence to intimacy, from ache to renewal. As night deepened, the firelight flickering across the walls, Clara realized that the cabin was more than a home. It was a living symbol of their journey, a space where love had taken root amidst the ruins of loss, where ache had unraveled into tenderness, and where two hearts had learned the quiet art of healing together. And in that still, luminous space, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared for months: the certainty that, even after the fall, love could grow, flourish, and reshape everything it touched. Spring arrived in the mountains quietly, painting the forest with tender greens and delicate blooms. The snowmote fed the creek, and sunlight poured through the branches, warming the cabin in golden streaks. Clara woke one morning to the sound of birdsong and the scent of fresh pine, and for the first time since the fall, she felt a profound sense of calm settle over her. The ache that had once defined her days had softened into a quiet memory, one that no longer ruled her heart. Elias was already awake, tending to the fire. He glanced up as she entered the room, a small smile playing on his lips. Their eyes met, and in that glance, Clara understood everything that had grown between them in the weeks since the crossing. It wasn't the whispered nights alone, nor the stormy evenings spent in tentative closeness, nor even the small rituals that had gradually woven them together. It was the accumulation of all of it, the patient unfolding of hearts that had once been broken but were learning to trust again. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that made her chest lift. "Good morning," she replied, feeling the simple words bloom into something richer, heavier with meaning. Then either could express. Breakfast was quiet and deliberate, their movements attuned to one another. Each glance, each shared sip of coffee carried unspoken affirmation of the bond that had taken root. Clara thought back to the fall, to the ache, to the whispers that had led her here. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet every step of that journey had been necessary, a prelude to this fragile, luminous present. After breakfast, they stepped outside, walking hand in hand along the familiar trails. The mountains had awakened from their winter sleep, and the air was crisp, sweet with the scent of budding leaves and wildflowers. Clara felt the wind against her face, the steady presence of Elias beside her, and a deep, abiding joy that had nothing to do with drama or grand gestures. It was quiet, real, and wholly theirs. They reached a clearing where sunlight spilled across moss-covered rocks, and for a moment they simply stood together, letting the world breathe around them. Clara turned to Elias and, without preamble, rested her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close, and she felt a fullness in her chest that had once seemed impossible. Love, she realized, could grow slowly, tenderly, in the spaces left by grief. The cabin awaited them as they returned, warm and alive, its walls filled with the echoes of shared laughter, whispered secrets, and small, intimate gestures that had slowly transformed it from a place of retreat into a home. Clara noticed how different it felt now, no longer a refuge from pain, but a sanctuary for life, for connection, for hope. The fire glowed in the hearth, the furniture arranged with careful intention, the sketches Elias had made of the forest, framed neatly along the walls. Every detail was a testament to the journey they had traveled together. That evening, as twilight painted the mountains in shades of violet and rose, Clara and Elias sat side by side on the porch. The air was cool, the sky vast, and the silence between them carried a weight of comfort and completeness. Clara allowed herself to reflect on everything that had brought her here. The fall, the ache, the whispers that had first reached her in the dead of night, and the patient, steady presence of Elias that had guided her toward healing. "I never imagined this," she said quietly, leaning against him, "that what began in whispers could become this." He kissed the top of her head gently. "Sometimes beginnings are quiet," he said. "Sometimes they arrive slowly, after storms, after falls. But they're real, and they last because we've built them together." Clara closed her eyes and let the truth of his words sink in. She felt the ache of the past dissolve fully now, leaving only gratitude, tenderness, and the warmth of love that was steady, patient, and alive. The cabin, the mountains, and the journey itself had taught her that endings could lead to beginnings, that solitude could give way to connection, and that hearts, once broken, could open again. As night settled over the forest, the stars scattered across the sky like scattered promises. Clara and Elias sat quietly together, their hands intertwined. The fall had been painful, the ache persistent, but it had led them here to a new beginning, to love forged in whispers, presence, and shared healing. And in the stillness of that night, Clara allowed herself to fully embrace it, the hope, the joy, and the certainty that even after the darkest fall, life could bloom again.